Welcome to Coffee with Coker, a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape. My name is Mark Reiboldt, and I'm the host of Coffee with Coker. And today we're joined by Coker CEO Max Reiboldt and Vice President Lee Perrett. And we're talking today about executive search process for hospitals, health systems, and really any healthcare organizations. Executive search is one of those things that Coker has actually done a number of years. We don't have a typical conventional approach as it relates to executive search. And this falls within, a number of our services as it relates to strategy and operations. But we really take a tailored approach to the executive search process. And we've seen a lot of success come out of that. And so that's what we talk about in this discussion. I think it's something that's helpful because a lot of organizations out there may not be aware that Coker does this, but more importantly, they may not be familiar with this type of approach that, again, is just different from convention and it's proven to work. It's just not as well known. And so I think that's why it's a helpful discussion for our clients, for our audience. And we wanted to highlight this. We want to bring Lee, who has decades of experience in search and HR and operations, and very, very well known and familiar with these processes. So again, it's a great discussion, and we hope you enjoy it. And as always, we thank you for listening. We always want to encourage our listeners to follow us. So you can follow us on social media. You can subscribe to the podcast on all the standard podcast platforms. You can find this episode as well as all of our episodes at coffeewithcoker.com, or you can find that full list and listen directly through the Coker website at cokergroup.com. We also want to encourage listeners to provide feedback. So if there's anything you've heard on this episode or any episode that you either have a question about or you'd like to provide feedback on, we'd love to hear that. And we'll make sure we address any questions in future episodes. And then also, if you have any recommendations for topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, we certainly welcome that feedback, and we'll make sure to address those topics in the future as they come up. So again, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy this episode. All right, so welcome to the podcast, Lee and Max. As I mentioned in the intro, we're talking about executive search for healthcare organizations. So this is one of those things, again, as I said, that Coker isn't as well known for, but we've done for many years, and we've developed kind of a methodology that has seemed to really work, and it's very different. It's very, I'd say, kind of unconventional compared to most executive search processes, but it's really proven to work. And so we're going to talk about that, and we actually will get to that here shortly. But before we dive into that, we just want to talk about the idea of executive search for healthcare organizations in general. We want to talk about kind of the process, what to look for, what organizations should be looking for as they're thinking about executive search, and some of the key questions that may come up, and what to look for in terms of looking for a firm to help them through this process. And so we're going to run through some of that, and then we'll kind of talk about Coker's approach here in a few minutes as well. But I guess maybe let's just start out, and Lee, feel free to jump in here. But, talk about some of the benefits for actually using an outside party, a firm, to help through an executive search process.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Several reasons that a organization should consider using an outside firm is, first of all, is that we and all executive search firms are experts in doing that work. And most organizations don't have the luxury of having a robust search organization within their organization. They don't have the numbers of people. They may not have the expertise or the knowledge. And depending on the size, if it's a hospital, large size health system, all the way down to a physician group, they may have an internal recruiting department, but those individuals are usually very, very busy. And for an executive search, it's usually at a pretty high level, usually at the C level. But we do search all the way down to the director level, and we can focus just on that position. And we don't have a lot of other positions that we're working on. And that's all that we do is retained executive search work in a healthcare environment. So for all those reasons, we think that an organization for specific positions should consider going outside and hiring an organization such as ours.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And I'm glad you actually touched on a point that I wanted to make too, in that when you hear executive search, I think it's typical to think the CEO, maybe the CFO, COO, something like that. But really, there are a lot of senior level positions that would go through a process like this. And it makes a lot of sense to, like you said, if you don't have that internal department, those internal resources to do it effectively, but to look at more than just maybe the quote unquote C-suite.
Right. And we do work, as I mentioned, all the way from the CEO level at a hospital system, all the way down to group practice administrators with a physician practice.
Yeah. Well, as an organization is thinking about this process, what are some of the questions maybe to ask before kind of diving in either themselves or working with a firm? Or what are some of the things they should be looking at or looking for?
Well, first of all, it's anytime you're picking out any consulting firm that you're going to be working with, is find out what their expertise is. We specifically only do healthcare work. Our executive search arm does. And Coker obviously does healthcare consulting work all across the board in a variety of areas, and we focus just on executive search, just in healthcare. So one of the first things that the organization should ask when they're looking at a search firm is, what's your expertise? Do you do work all across the board, everything from banking to energy to finance to manufacturing, and you happen to do healthcare work? Or do you specifically focus on healthcare work? Secondly, it would be important to find out who's actually going to be doing the work at the organization or the search firm that you choose. How much experience do they have? What's their knowledge base? What's their network like? What's their process? Have them walk you through their process and actually get to meet the people that are going to be doing the work. Oftentimes a search consultant might go in and sell the business to an organization and then come back and turn that work over to somebody else at the firm that has not met the principles there at the organization, and potentially could be a junior person that doesn't have a lot of experience. So finding out who exactly is going to be working on the search itself is important.
Yeah. Maybe talk a little bit to the fact that maybe it seems obvious that specializing in healthcare is a positive, but maybe talk a little bit more about why, because I think this ties to Coker's approach as far as executive search, but why that's so relevant and such an important distinction.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. And thanks, Lee, for those introductory comments. We've done executive search for a long time. We've been around over 30 years, and I would say at least 20 of those years in some form or fashion, we've done search work. And the last 10 years or so is how we've, I think, enhanced the way we go about doing it. And to some extent, maybe we've always done it this way, but we consider ourselves more so consultants that are experts in the work that the client has asked us to do outside of executive search many times. Now, some cases we'll start out a relationship only doing the search work and that's it. But most of the time it evolves from an existing relationship where we've done either revenue cycle review, operational assessment, fair market value opinion, evaluation, a transaction, IT services, etc. And so we've gotten to know the client. And in most cases, let's just take an example of a CEO of let's just say a hospital physician enterprise, an employed group. That CEO, or maybe sometimes they're called COO positions. We most likely understand and know the makeup and the nuances of that particular position within that organization, with all due respect, better than anybody, because we've worked with them. In some cases, we may have even fulfilled an interim position, or we're in the midst of doing that. So again, our approach is to be consultative in our search work and to apply, in many instances, the knowledge that we already have of the client and the position, and maybe even some of those idiosyncrasies that the client brings. Nothing bad, just the way they are and the way they operate, so we can really match the best fit. And at the end of the process, that's really what it's all about, is finding a good match for the client. So that's our approach.
Yeah. And I think another kind of example there is, or envision a CIO search. You know, it's one thing to be able to look at okay, this organization needs a CIO. Our search people are going to go kind of execute a process, but it's different when you're going and executing that process. And oh, by the way, part of that process entails some of our own people that have been a CIO before and understand healthcare technology and understand what it's like to actually do the CIO's job to help through the process, even through the interviewing and evaluating process, because they're going to know probably better than anybody, if they've been in that position before, some of the characteristics and being able to evaluate candidates, I think, which is very helpful. Let's talk for a second about the process and maybe kind of the general search process, but then tie back into, as we were just talking about, kind of Coker's model, what that looks like, what our approach looks like a lot of times during that process.
Mm-hmm. We do have a set process that's fairly broad that we follow, but we also customize every search. Every search is different. Every position within every organization is different, and so we treat a search as being different. But we do have a broad process that we start out with. We're not cookie cutter. The first thing we do is we schedule a site visit with the client where I or the consultant that would be assigned to the project would go actually to the site, and we would meet with all of the key decision makers that are going to be involved in selecting that individual. We would also get a tour of the facility. We would also talk with other individuals that they would be interacting with. If it's a CEO position, we would meet with board members who are on the selection committee and as many of the board members as they thought was prudent for us to speak with. We gather as much information as we can during that visit. I always like to say it's like I'm a sponge there for that visit and trying to gather up as much information as I can in order to come back and be able to, A, recruit the right kind of people that are going to be a match for that role, but B, just as importantly, be able to explain to potential candidates what the organization's like, what the people there are like, what the reporting relationships are going to be like, and a little bit about the culture. So after the site visit, we come back and I would develop, if I was doing the search, I would develop what we call a client candidate profile, which we would then take that information that I gathered during the site visit, distill that down to three main pieces. One is talking about the organization itself and what I learned there on the site visit. The second one, which is key, is talking about the position itself. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What are the criteria they're looking for? Background, skills, experience, education level. And the third piece is most of the positions we'll recruit for require relocation to that organization's area. We would have a part of the profile that would talk about the attractiveness of the community. Why should someone want to move to that community? And so we complete that document in those three pieces, and that's our marketing document that we then use to go out and recruit candidates. We'll share that document back with the client, let them edit it, make sure we captured everything they wanted us to capture. Then we'll formalize that document and start recruiting candidates. We do what we call casting a wide net. And so we go out and try to attract as many qualified candidates as we can. That's both from what we call passive recruiting, which would be posting the position on professional organizations' websites, potentially on LinkedIn, on some other sites out there. And then we also do active, proactive recruiting, where we would go on either professional organizations or we would go on LinkedIn and target specific individuals that we thought might have the background and experience that were needed. And we contact those individuals and see if they, may be interested in being considered for a new opportunity, or if they're not, or they can't relocate, who else do they know? And we also will tap our internal network. Our consultants are out there each and every day in hospitals and in physician groups doing consulting work, and they obviously know people out there in the system that we can tap to say, who do you know that might be a good match for this position, or who has this background and experience, or who can you lead us to that might know who that is? We go through that process and start generating candidates. We'll share that client profile with them. If they have interest, and we hope they do, we'll speak with them on the phone, do a brief telephone interview with them, share that information back with the client, and indicate that we have some candidates that we think are qualified and are on the target that they have given us. They would then let us know who of those candidates they would like for us to pursue further. We would then narrow that process down a little bit more and do either a face-to-face interview with that individual, or more likely a Skype or video interview with that individual. Those interviews generally take about 45 minutes to an hour. We would be able to better judge where we think that person is a good match. We would narrow the field down further. We would present a short list to the client, usually would be from 3 to 7 people. They would then determine who they would want to invite on their campus in their organization to do a face-to-face interview. And as we work through that process, we would assist them in doing interview schedules. We can help them prepare interview questions depending on the sophistication of the organization and whether they needed that help or not, and then walk them through the whole process. So from start to finish, we would do the site visit and would work with the client all the way up until the person accepts the position and up until the time they join the organization and start.
Yeah. Well, a couple things jumped out at me as far as when you're walking through that process. One, I think, a lot of times it's easy to think as far as recruiting that, okay, put together the job description, understand the compensation, maybe, a couple of things as far as, like you said, moving costs, expenses, relocation, things like that. But there's really a lot more to it, right? I mean, it's especially when you're talking about senior level roles. And yeah, it's not all on paper, a lot comes through that process of the multiple conversations, the vetting process, evaluating against, maybe generic criteria to a certain extent, but you're also vetting and evaluating against very specific criteria for that individual organization. Like you said, it's a very tailored approach. One hospital may have very different needs and targets for their next, executive position compared to another hospital or compared to a group or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's part of what we do is to match up the individual and their background and experience to the culture of the organization. That's where the art part of recruiting comes in. The science part is a computer could do that. Give me somebody that's got this kind of experience, this kind of background, this kind of education, lives in this zip code. Computer can basically generate resumes.
Sure.
The harder part is actually once you've identified those people is doing the evaluation of whether that person's skill set is a match. But harder to do, and probably as important, if not most important, is determining if they are going to be a fit for that organization. Mm-hmm. Organizations, particularly at the director and up level, tend to hire and make the hiring decision based on their background, skills, and experience. But usually if a person leaves an organization, either voluntarily or they're asked to leave, it's because they weren't a fit. And there was some type of cultural mismatch. They didn't match the culture. They couldn't get along with people. There were other issues that should have come out in an interview. And that's what we try to determine is that part of that site visit again is to determine what kind of culture that organization has. And every organization has a different culture. Yeah. And so we ask that question when we go on a site visit is describe your culture to us. So we get a good feel for the culture. And then as we're interviewing candidates, we try to see if that person is going to be, determine if that person is going to be a good fit for that culture. And I think we do a pretty good job in that area. And that's as important, if not more important than actually having the skill set.
And I think what you just said, Lee, is potentially a little bit of a differentiator for us because oftentimes at some point you or we will bring in one of the consultants who's not necessarily a recruiter, but knows the organization, understands, again, the personalities and so forth. And so they'll actually become active in the search. I remember one that we just completed, and you'll recall this well too, out west for a large oncology group, frankly, at least in their minds, had a difficult search because of where it was located. We didn't necessarily agree with that. We think it's a pretty nice place, but we actually found an individual from a nearby state, or our firm did, and I know 2 or 3 of the consultants, I happen to be working on that project as well, actually went out there and assisted in the interview processes of several candidates. And it was a very, I thought, a very fulfilling experience for us. And I think the client realized it had value as well. And again, that's just the package that we try to supply to the search process.
And to add on to that, the candidate appreciates it too, because the candidate can ask the consultants who have actually been there working with the client to give them more additional information. I have not been there necessarily working in depth with the client, would not have that information. So the candidates appreciate, in this case, Max and one of our senior consultants had actually been there working with that client for some period of time and could talk specifically about the things they were working on, as well as the personalities of the physician group. And that was very beneficial in helping bring that individual on board, and she's doing a great job.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, again, not to harp on this too much, but the culture fit is to me the most critical thing. Because again, you can look and see how people meet or don't meet certain criteria on a piece of paper, right? And like you said, there's all kinds of evaluation techniques that can assess someone's management style or experience and quantify certain data points, I guess. But putting that into the context of an individual organization, which has its own dynamics, its own background, context, all of that stuff, also a mixture of other leadership roles and personalities there, that's going to really play a huge role in terms of the long-term success. And we've seen hospitals and health systems and medical groups all going through multiple executives over a short period of time. It has a major impact. And so this is more than just a search or filling a role type process, but it truly is something that's about the long-term improvement, efficiency, operational value for that organization, as well as kind of their growth strategy. I think the other thing that's interesting is you think about one person, again, they may meet all the criteria as far as comparison on paper, but if you take their management style and you put it in the context of say a small hospital in rural North Dakota or wherever you pick the place, then you're going to, there may be some unique dynamics there. Same thing, somebody that comes from certain background, yes, they may have had certain roles in other hospitals, but that's very different from trying to go and manage a 600 physician enterprise employed network in a large urban-based acute care environment or something like that. I mean, there's different things to look for, and it's hard to really understand what's going to work in an organization unless A, you truly understand that organization, and B, can bring perspective of having been in that a similar type role, I guess.
Exactly. And we usually we have consultants who have had that experience. Yeah. Everything from working with that rural hospital in North Dakota up through an urban health system. Yeah. Or could be even a university environment,
sure,
medical school. Those are entirely different, but we can tap into our consultant base and knowledge and saying, help us vet these candidates on who you think would be a good match from a culture fit as well as an experience fit.
I think the other interesting thing you said, or that jumped out at me as far as walking through that process, is leveraging our network. And, this is more than just circulating ads or even, putting out notifications on the internet, social media, LinkedIn, those types of things. But it's truly going back through. I always like to think, Coker's been in business in the healthcare industry for over 30 years. And I like to think it's fairly small world. The healthcare industry is. People move around a good bit. And, we've worked with people the same person at multiple organizations. And we've also kept in contact with a lot of folks that may have left or may be looking to kind of move on or expand into a new role, something like that. And that's always helpful, because when a client comes to us and says, hey, we're looking to fill this role, we may already have a good short list for them to start with.
That's often the case. And that's usually one of the first things we do once we get that client profile developed, is to tap our internal network. So here's a new position we have open. It's in this location. Here's the thumbnail overview of what we're looking for. And then oftentimes, I'll use Max as an example. Max has in his head probably 6 or 8 people already he knows that might A, be interested, or B, Lee might know someone just from his number of years of experience doing this. And like you said, we have people who we stay in touch with. And I had one actually this morning sent me an email, guy I talked with a couple of years ago as a source. He was a source for candidates, and he is now looking for personal reasons. He's out west. He's looking for personal reasons to move back closer to home for some personal things that are going on. So he said, hey, do you have anything in this area? Mm-hmm. And I'm looking to potentially make a change at this point. So we have people reaching back out to us all the time. We do keep an active database of individuals like him. That's another place that we look initially, just to say, who do we already know or who have we already talked with about a position in the past that we can now recontact to see, A, are they interested in this role, and B, would they be a good candidate, or would they have a referral? So yes, our network is vast. We believe that's a definite advantage to what we do. And again, our network is just in healthcare. Yeah. If you were saying, hey, we're looking for a banker or we're looking for an oil and gas person, our network's probably not going to be the place that we'd find those individuals. However, if it's healthcare oriented, whether it's a physician group in North Dakota or it's a large metropolitan based health system, we are going to know people who would be interested in those roles and qualified.
Yeah. And the other piece there that I think is important, we know those people, right? And so we know, again, you may not see this on paper, but say there's an opening in whatever region, and we know that that individual's spouse is originally from there, and they're at a point where, maybe they're looking to relocate and get back closer to family or something like that, or their kids may be living in that part of the country and they'd like to be closer to grandkids or whatever that may be. Those are things that don't jump out at first, but we may be able to hone in on and spot pretty quick and play into the evaluation process. I have to think a lot of times these processes come up and you're talking a scenario of, hey, we just found out our name that position is is resigned or is looking to leave or is retiring or whatever. What can organizations do or be thinking about as far as getting ahead? So I'm specifically talking about succession here, right? Mm-hmm. Thinking about a succession plan for an organization's executive team or senior level team, such that you're not having to scramble. And so you can actually go through this process. You can hit all the necessary steps and maybe even do it proactively if it's appropriate. So you have some lead time, and you're not scrambling. Talk about the importance of that, maybe.
Well, I think the importance of being able to respond to any particular situation like that is not any different than what we're faced with and throughout our regular, non-executive search advisory services. You really isolate the scope of what the client's looking for. You, in this case, identify the position, the profile of what they're looking for, and then, obviously you're looking to complete a match. I think the other thing that's important, and I don't know if maybe this is not the right time to bring it up, but I'll go ahead and mention, is the financial package that we should put together. We understand and know a lot about, again, from having done consulting services for most of these clients, what their affordability is, what their current pay structure is, what the prospective position would be. And so I think that's a big part of what we can, and any search consultant should provide to a client, is to tell them what the market is. Again, just citing an example of a placement we just did. Lee worked on a COO position for a physician enterprise owned by a hospital, about 200 in the Northeast, about 200 providers that they employ. And if memory serves me correctly, Lee, they started out identifying that the compensation package for this position was, let's say, in the mid 100 to 200, about 150. And in this case, we pointed out that, well, given the breadth of this position, which I think is another point, Mark, that we want to get to, and that's a strong job description, so we understand that. But in this case, we pointed out that, well, the market and really what you're looking for in this position is closer to 200 with some bonus potential on top of that. So I don't know that the client was all that enthralled initially, but I think at the end, the realization of getting a very highly qualified, competent, and truly deserving individual of that salary was of great value to them.
Right. Well, and it's better to know that on the front end going into it, and then you can be competitive and you can find the right person from the get-go as opposed to maybe getting the wrong person because your expectations were a little off.
And we always tell the client going in that we don't create the market. If they say, we usually ask them, what's your compensation ballpark target? And they'll tell us. And sometimes they'll say, do you think that's the appropriate amount? And we'll say whether we think it is or not. And then we'll say, we don't know until we get out there. And to Max's point, initially we thought that might be a little bit low, but we didn't know until we got out there. And not only was the individual that they ended up hiring at that range, a couple of 3 others that were also targeted that were good candidates were in that range. So the market, quote unquote, for that level person at a VP level was a little higher than what they knew going in. And that's normal. They're not out there every day shopping in the market, so they don't know.
That's what they expect us to provide.
Exactly. And we don't try to inflate the compensation. We come back and tell them, here's what these individuals are making. And sometimes I've got this going on right now where I've got a senior level chief operating officer position and I've been given a target, but the candidates that we have presented that they like the most are a little higher than that target. And that's okay too, but it's their decision at that point to whether they want to move a little bit north of the range that they started out with, but to get the kind of person that they've indicated they want, as well as the individuals that they have already interviewed initially, it's probably going to take that. Mm-hmm. And going back to your earlier point about succession planning, is we have a white paper out there, I believe, on that, and it's difficult to do. It's very easy to say, but it's difficult to do is to look at your talent pipeline from a succession planning standpoint. But what I would encourage organizations to do is to look at your key people in your organizations. That's not just your C-suite, but that's at your key director levels and up, and say, is there anybody that we are in jeopardy of losing? Yeah. And that could be retirement. That could be somebody that says, I only want to work another 2 or 3 years and then retire or go do something else. But look at the people in those roles. And if they've got somebody that they think is going to exit for whatever reason in the next 5 to 7 years, they need to ask themselves 2 questions. One is there anybody that's behind them that we could train and develop to get to that level? And if there's not, they need to be thinking now, depending on what kind of timeline there is, about recruiting a replacement. Mm-hmm. If it's sometime within the next year, they need to be thinking right now about recruiting externally. Yeah. One thing we hear sometimes from clients is that we think that this person internally is pretty good, but we're not really sure if they're the best. And so often we've done this, and I have this going on right now with a client, is that there's an internal person that they think might be able to do the role that's open, but they're not sure, and they want to compare this individual to see what's outside. And so we tell the client, we can include your internal candidate or candidates as part of the process, and we will evaluate them and give you our neutral third-party opinion on all the candidates. Everybody's equal. Mm-hmm. We don't treat the internal candidate any differently than the external candidate. And so we'll evaluate the candidates equally, internal and external, and give them our evaluation and our recommendation on each of the candidates. They make the final decision, but that has been valuable to lots of clients. Sometimes the internal candidate was better than they thought compared to the externals, and other times it was the flip of that. Mm-hmm. The externals were head and shoulders above the internal, and that's why they made the move. But at least the internal candidate got an opportunity to throw their hat in the ring and to be considered, and the external candidates come in with the basically the thinking that, okay, they got evaluated against the internal, and so we chose the best candidate on the market.
Yeah, it's very validating, I'm sure. And I think that's even more important as you think about hospitals and healthcare organizations. There's for many, if not most, a community impact there, and there's an obligation there. Let's make sure we have the best people.
Absolutely.
And I think also on the succession piece, there's when you're looking at some of these roles, not only are you looking at people at risk of leaving because of retiring or whatever it may be, or even performance that need to be replaced, performance issues, but there's also a lot of folks in different roles that are kind of superstars, and you have to understand, you have to put a create a pathway for them to grow and to kind of achieve their goals, or you are going to lose them and you're going to have a gap there. And even if you know, hey, this person, they're going to be moving on, they're going to do big things maybe. So we may not be able to keep them forever, but we can make sure that the value they bring to this organization can be translated through whoever comes and, fulfills their follows in their footsteps afterwards.
That's a very good point. And, the superstars, as you call them, the ones that are really strong in their position, are known to recruiters.
Yeah.
I had a recent candidate that was a VP level candidate, and she told me she gets at least 2 calls a week from recruiters looking for somebody like her. And in her case, she did not want to relocate. And so, but she said she gets calls for that. It was a revenue cycle position. They're in high demand. Mm-hmm. And she said that the recruiters have her name and they're out there recruiting. So the organizations need to protect their candidates that if hopefully they're in a pipeline and being developed. If not, they need to make sure they develop those individuals, or at least let them know there's opportunities for growth. Otherwise, they shouldn't be surprised if somebody comes in at some point and picks them off.
The other thing that is kind of in play here, and we're talking around it, but not directly about it. So I'll just, and I'm not saying that was wrong, but I'll just say executive compensation is another factor here. Sometimes you might lose a candidate because family, just wanting to relocate, but oftentimes it is, you might lose an executive is what I meant to say, but oftentimes it's because maybe they don't feel like they're being challenged, they're growing, and their compensation isn't as well. So, a lot of things from a consultative standpoint will involve just looking at the executive compensation, the C-suite. Let's just say, for example, we recently did one, so I'll use it as an example of a hospital, and they named the CEO, CFO, COO, CNO, and I think CIO, and maybe one other almost C-level position, but slightly less. And they essentially said, look at compare these to market, their wages. Tell us how we compare for both now and prospectively in the future, based on tenure, based on their job description, based on their position title, et cetera. And then work on not only telling us how we compare to market, but look at some additional incentives that we could put into place for that team. And so I think that sometimes is certainly maybe called a defensive measure. I think it's an offensive measure because I think if you have good people, you want to keep them. You want to make sure they're growing. But let's face it, if you're a COO in a hospital, there's really only one place you can go in that hospital. There's one other position. And realistically, that position may not be open. So, but yet you don't want to lose that individual. And so to avert that, you need to look at their compensation, maybe their job description, and you could expand some of their duties. Maybe you could set up some incentives that would entail them reaching out a little bit further than they are currently have had to do within their position. So I think there's some real innovative things. And as consultants, we try to approach working with clients in that manner. And so it may or may not actually even be a recruiting assignment in that case.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that and brought it up. We call it executive search. Really, it ties into a number of different services that relate to personnel and particularly organizational leadership. Because, when you think about, search is kind of a single process, specific process or scenario. But, if the executive compensation isn't there and the right package isn't there, then, there's more going on. Also, you find a lot of organizations, I think, that when they've gone through multiple different positions and key leadership roles in a relatively short period of time, I think we can all probably agree there's other things going on potentially at that organization, as far as whatever it may be. And so again, it goes back to getting the right people, but also keeping the right people and making sure that, the financial resources are there to do that, making sure the, operational procedures and protocols are in place. There's a lot more to it than just kind of putting a person in a role and expecting magic to happen, I guess. Mm-hmm. The other thing there, I think, is that's interesting when you're evaluating these different cases. Whenever you're filling a role, particularly an executive role, they may be coming into a unique situation, meaning maybe they're coming into, maybe the previous administration had left for specific reasons. And so you're coming in potentially to a challenging environment, mm-hmm. whether it's, internal politics, whether it's actual politics, when you think about, maybe hospitals and health systems that are owned by hospital authorities and are almost quasi-government organizations, or there's community stuff going on. Maybe there's financial issues there. Maybe it's a full-on turnaround. We've been involved in cases where literally they're, maybe facing closure of a facility, or maybe they're looking to go into a transaction. And so, listen, this job may not be here in a year or two. You're coming into something where you may be going through maybe a sale of an entity. Well, but we still need the right leadership going through that process. And I think that ties into some of the other services, because maybe they don't need a full-time CEO or full-time administrator or whatever, but maybe there's an interim role that mm-hmm. needs to be called on. Maybe. And so I don't know, there's a lot there, but if we can kind of tie that back to some of the other services and other kind of scenarios we're involved within, interim is oftentimes something that comes up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interim is extremely important, and a lot of it has to do with timing, obviously, of both the departure and the timing of the replacement. It's getting comfortable, and maybe even an interim will be somewhat of a stopgap while we're evaluating the existing C-suite, for example. So they're not sure if any of the existing C-suite are ready for the CEO position, but so therefore an interim would be best to fill it, because obviously you can't, if you name one of those individuals, let's say the CFO as an interim CEO, then it's really tough to undo that later. So interims make a lot of sense. And the other thing that we have found that I think is incredibly important as we're working with these candidates is to help not only the client identify the right profile, the right characteristics, but we've also utilized and continue to utilize a PhD executive coach that both helps us with the recruitment and, in many instances, post-placement. That individual will work with the candidate on an ongoing basis. And I know, Lee, this is something from your past days at Coca-Cola, in previous work lives and so forth, where you saw a lot of, folks like them that enhance executives' ability to be effective. And sometimes we use that term executive coach, because to me, that's all that is. So maybe you'd like to embellish a little bit further into that point here.
Sure. And we use our coach in several different areas within a search. We will sometimes, if it's a CEO search reporting to a board, or it could be a quasi-governmental group where it reports to an appointed board, but he would go in and work with them initially to determine the leadership capabilities that were needed, what their leadership style is, what kind of individual they're looking for as part of that initial site visit that we do. During the recruiting process, he administers different assessment tools. We happen to use one called Hogan. There's others out there like DISC and others that are just as good, but Dr. Streaker uses those during the process to help narrow down the, again, culture fit, and the individuals have the right leadership competencies, management leadership style, and the things that he heard the board say they were looking for. And it could be positions other than a CEO. And then after the person is hired, he does onboarding and coaching with that individual up to 90 days. And depending on the level of the position, we offer that for everyone, but depending on the level of the position, we sometimes will include that as part of our search, part of our fee, the leadership coaching. And the first 100 days on a new position, whether it's a CEO, which is extremely critical, on down to really any position, but we found that the first 100 days are critical for a new person to come on board and be successful. And so our coach works with that individual during those first 100 days and does individual coaching to help them do a better job during those 100 days and to get off to a great start. And we found that has been very valuable in the success of some of the people that we have placed. And he does a fantastic job. He can work directly with the board and with the decision makers. We've had conference calls before where they would interpret or they would ask questions about the interpretation of some of the Hogan assessments. We actually did it one time with 5 different CEO candidates for a client, and they got to ask questions after they had interviewed each of the candidates. They got to ask questions about specifically, what does this mean on this leadership competency and how would that fit into our organization? And Dr. Streaker was able to explain exactly what that meant and how it would fit into their organization. He had met with the board. He'd been up there on the initial site visit, so he knew them just as I did, and that worked very well. And he then worked with the new CEO once they were hired, and that individual is doing just fine now, and that first 100 days was critical.
Yeah. I mean, I think especially for executive level or senior level leadership roles, that getting started on the right foot is so critical. And sometimes there's little to no margin for error during that period, particularly if, the organization has it may be going through a certain situation or challenging period or just certain expectations, I guess. And
it gives the new CEO in this case, and it could be a new COO or director level. It gives them a confidence that they've got somebody they can talk to offline. They can have that person in their confidence. Obviously, Dr. Streaker works very closely with them, knows them very well, and it gives them a coach. Just like anything else, if you get a coach and you can ask for advice, you'll do better. You'll perform better.
Absolutely, and yeah, I think it also helps validate the decision probably as well for the organization or the board or whoever they're reporting to or answering to. There's a lot there that can be a lot of value in that validation, I guess, just because, those things, particularly larger the organization is, but really any business challenge or business scenario, rarely do they just automatically turn around overnight. Or do you see, magic happen all of a sudden? So I think that's important to kind of understand going in, but also prepare yourself for, okay, this is a process. Well, let's make sure we set it up correctly and then we'll follow the path.
Right.
Well, this has been very helpful. Bringing it full circle, the last thing I wanted to ask, and you alluded to this earlier, Lee, but maybe I just want to kind of revisit and we can close on this, but the idea that bringing in a firm like Coker to help facilitate this process, whatever that means, whatever that needs to look like for each individual case. We're not just talking about, large multi-facility health systems or urban-based academic medical centers or what people probably typically think about. But this stuff matters to a medical practice, to a critical access hospital in rural America, whatever it may be. And in fact, I'd say some of those different scenarios are almost more important because they don't have those internal resources. Maybe they are in an organization, a situation or a location that's a little bit tougher to recruit to, but nevertheless, they still need the right leadership. And then they're going to have leadership needs, resources that are needed on an ongoing basis as well. So maybe I just talked to you a little bit about, this isn't just for the big players, so to speak.
Exactly. And we do, as you said, we do everything from CEOs at large systems all the way down to small practice physician practices in some rural areas. Got a couple of those going on right now. And as you said, they don't have a sophisticated, large human resources department with a recruiting arm that does this every day. They only recruit as they have needs. I spent 16 years at the Coca-Cola company on the other side of the desk in human resources roles, mostly recruiting and doing search work. And so I've been on their side of the desk. And so I tell them going in as I will be your consultant with a big C and will help you go through the process to try to identify and recruit the best possible candidate that we can. And that's for all size candidates or for clients, whether it's a hospital or a small practice administrator. So, yes, we do offer that, and we do pretty much all types of positions in between, from a practice administrator at a physician group all the way up to a CEO. And again, we tailor every search to each individual position and each individual client. And we enjoy doing that kind of work.
Yeah. And I think the other piece there is helping them through that process. Some of it's just being a resource there. So again, back to the financial package, a smaller, quote unquote, whatever that means, organization and in a certain area, may not think they have the financial resources to attract the right kind of candidate they need, but maybe there are other ways to structure that compensation. Maybe you can work with incentives and bonuses a little more and have value, just like what we talk about with physician comp. They're the kind of pay for performance, if you will, and the whole value-based reimbursement models. I mean, those things can be applied into executive compensation models as well. And so I think helping work through those alternatives so that no organization has to go into this process thinking they're already kind of a few steps behind, I guess.
Right. We can do that. And we also have our invoicing can be creative. Yeah. We can work with groups to come up with a creative way to invoice. The other thing that we do is that we don't charge like a lot of firms based on the calendar date. We charge shouldn't say charge, we invoice based on performance.
Sure.
So our second invoice is not based on time. It's based on when we produce candidates that the client has agreed look pretty good and would like to proceed with further. A lot of other firms will do that based on 30 days after they start. We don't think that's fair. So we do it based on performance, and then the final invoice is not due until they actually have made an offer and that person has accepted the position. And so we have skin in the game, if you will, going all the way through until the person accepts the offer. And then even after that, we stay in touch with the candidate, make sure they're going to be getting on board okay. There are no issues that come up at the last minute. So we'll hold their hand right up until the point they show up for work their first week. So we've got some creative and non-traditional ways to work with clients if those things are a concern.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We didn't even talk about kind of our fee structure, and that's also very, I think, atypical as far as what else you'd see out there. And I think it boils down to, again, as cliche and maybe hokey as it may sound, we truly want the client to succeed with the right people. And that can't happen by just putting a body in a specific seat. It has to be the right person at the right time, the right structure, I guess. And that's what really this process probably boils down to. So I think that's great.
And we had a group that recently we were in touch with, and they tried to do the search on their own and spent several months. I think they said 4 months working through the board and the existing C-suite trying to identify candidates. They identified several. And they did not work out for one way or the other. And then they approached us and said, would you be able to assist us in this? And we said, absolutely, we could. But they tried to do it on their own. It didn't work out for them. And they were actually spent 4 months doing that and came up empty.
Yeah. Only to kind of start over with the process.
So I think, Mark and Lee, as we summarize what we're really talking about and would encourage others that are considering within the healthcare space needs of the nature that we've talked about today is kind of a global overarching approach to managing human capital. The single greatest resource in any healthcare entity, and I might add the greatest expense, is personnel, staff, and the competencies that surround that. That's our greatest item of, quote, inventory. We don't, generally speaking, make widgets or manufacture items. We don't sell bottles of Coke and related that Lee used to do or help do. But what we do is have a great reservoir of people. And so what we believe is important at Coker Group, along with all the other consulting work that we do, is to provide services surrounding human capital, whether it's recruitment, fitting the right position, executive comp, executive coaching, all those things. And whether you use Coker or not, I think the message to those listening on this podcast would be to really invest in your people, in services like this when you have needs for an opening or just ongoing building of relationships. So that's what we think is so very important.
Yeah, well, I think that's well said. We'll also make sure that the links to the to white papers that Lee and others here at Coker have done in the past are available, so that our listeners can maybe read up a little bit more or get a little bit more information. And then we'll look forward to talking more about some of these things in the future. So thank you all for joining us today. And like I said, we'll look forward to talking more about this very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them, and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.